Bien, alors on va continuer. Donc, on a pris beaucoup de retard, mais je pense que ce n'est pas très grave parce qu'il y a des pauses et puis la pause de midi était relativement longue. Donc, je pense qu'on pourra aisément le récupérer et je préfère donner, je dirais, du temps aux échanges. Donc, on va passer à la présentation de Thorsten Hemming. Thorsten, il est directeur de recherche en physique au laboratoire de physique théorique et de modèles statistiques donc, de l'université de Paris-Saclay, pardon. Donc, c'est un spécialiste en fait de physique statistique qui combine à la fois des méthodes analytiques et numériques. Je pense qu'il aura l'occasion de revenir là-dessus, pardon. Et donc, il les applique à différents domaines, dans le domaine de la biologie. Et là, en l'occurrence, je pense qu'il va nous illustrer ce travail à travers des choses qu'il a fait dans le domaine du sport et plus précisément de la physiologie de l'exercice et de la course à pied. Je te laisse la parole.
Thank you, Vincent. I'm very happy to join this meeting, and I hope it's fine if I give my presentation in English. I think we agreed on this before. So we're changing language, but I think we're also changing gears a little bit because, as you said, my background is theoretical physics, and I think my talk will be more based on ideas from physics than based on ideas from artificial intelligence, but I hope that there will be some common aspects, and I will also explain the use of what is called big data. And I hope that we see at the end of my talk some joint or common interest in this field, and perhaps even can learn about some new directions or projects. Okay, so this work that I'm going to talk about today is one of the projects that I'm doing in the context of, let's say, interdisciplinary sports science, which I started about 2.5 years ago when I was at a joint MIT-CNRS lab in Boston, where I was a member for multiple years. And so my background, as I said, is statistical physics. But during the time in Boston, I also became involved in sports on the practical level, I should say. And I'm also a member of the Boston Athletic Association that organizes since more than 100 years the Boston Marathon. So I have kind of connection to both sides of the business. And okay, so let's start. I would like to give you first a quick overview of what I think has been an important change in the field. I'm going to talk mainly about running, long distance running. And as I would like to show you here is the big progress that has been made on the technological side of monitoring sports performance. So the first picture you see here is from the 70s that were first experiments done on the track to measure oxygen uptake by a guy called Jack Daniels in the US. And you see they were driving basically with a car next to the runners on the track and measuring the oxygen uptake. So this was in the 70s. And nowadays we have a whole tool of new devices to measure sports performance. It's on the kind of level of smartwatches, which now everybody can buy and use for running, biking, whatever. Of course, also on the level of elite sports, much progress has been made. There have been tailored races on Formula One racing tracks, where everything is close to optimal conditions. And also there has been big progress on the material side aspect in designing new shoes. And this has been actually, as we will see later, probably generated a new era of increased running performance. Okay, let me go to some typically used models. This is my perspective as a physicist. So I might, of course, miss here some other ideas from physiology. Please forgive me. So this is kind of my kind of physicist point of view. And so there are a number of course, performance models on the market that try to describe running performance. And what I think is an important point that many of these models have some drawbacks, like all models. Of course, in physics, this is also true. And I would like to point out here some particular aspects which are related to these models that are based on a single parameter. For example, there's a maximal oxygen uptake known as VO2 max, or what is also known as V dot or running index. And this is one parameter that is often used to describe running performance. For example, all these smart watches that recreational runners use, they are based on this single number. They estimate it more or less accurately. I come to back to this later. What is often ignored is that the physiological profiles of individual runners can be very different. So you can't use just a fixed parameter in the models, which is often done. One example is the oxygen uptake that a runner needs to run at a given speed. Let's say you want to run at a speed of 16 kilometers per hour. This is about 6 minutes per mile. And the oxygen uptake that has been measured in runners reaches from 40 to almost 70 milliliters per kilogram body weight and minute. So this is a huge range. If you fix this number in a model, you can imagine that this causes big inaccuracies. Then also we have observed, or one observes this, and this is the effect of training, that physiological profiles of athletes change over the course of training. And this is what we want. So we don't want to fix these parameters in models. And the last point I would like to point out that there are also some parameters that are extremely difficult to measure in a lab. For example, you never place or rarely place a runner on a treadmill to run a marathon and monitor the running of 2 or 3 hours in a lab. This is very difficult and probably also not very realistic because the environment is rather artificial. So this is the current status. Now, what I call applied physiology is if you use these models and put them into some devices, which is actually done. So there are these simple ideas that are converted into some algorithms and then integrated in the smart watches that you can nowadays buy. And as I pointed out before, a common parameter is the so-called VO2 max, the maximum oxygen uptake, which is by some companies called running index or whatsoever. It doesn't matter, it's the same concept. And it is estimated based on the heart rate that this watch measures during your running activity. Now this parameter by some models is predicted to give a very good estimate of the, let's say, racing time for a marathon race. And what I'm showing you here is the actual data showing the correlation between the running index, which is shown here. So this you can consider as an estimate of the runner's VO2 max, and the marathon time in hours. And you can see that for a given running index of VO2 max, there is a range of marathon times that differs by 2 hours, which is absolutely incredible because this is so inaccurate. Basically, you can run with a VO2 max from this estimate a time between 3 hours and almost 6 hours, or 5 to 6 hours. So this is basically covering all running performances that are out there. So this is clearly not a very reliable approach, but this is current industry standards, let's say. Now, what we wanted to do is we wanted to take a physics approach. So we built a simple model, try to validate the model, and then in the last step, apply it to big data. So this is basically the general idea that I would like to present you now. So and the model is sufficiently simple that it makes no additional assumption beyond what is observed in exercise laboratories. The first concept here is the energy cost of running. So how much energy does a runner need to run at a given speed? And this is to a good approximation a linear curve. Here's the running speed, and on the vertical axis is the oxygen uptake, which is a direct measure of the energy used to run a given speed. There is a maximum for this oxygen uptake, of course, which varies from runner to runner, but does this really tell you how fast the runner can run a race? And this is an example showing 3 different runners that raced a 3,000 meter race at almost the same time. So the running speed for the 3,000 meter race was about 330 meters per minute, corresponding to this point here. But the maximum oxygen uptake was rather different and varied between 60 and 73 milliliters per kilogram body weight and minute. So how can you explain this difference in oxygen uptake, but the same running speed or performance on a 3,000 meter race? Well, it's what is called energy cost of running or the running economy, which means that the runner here, which has a low VO2 max, can just run much more efficiently, and he needs, or she, this is female runners, needs much less energy to run a given speed. And this is actually something that changes a lot during training. So what I would like to point out that the speed is actually the relevant quantity. And this makes me happy as a physicist because we like to talk about speeds. So let's consider this as the first parameter of the model, the speed that a runner can run at the maximum oxygen uptake. So this is not the maximal speed, but the maximal aerobic speed. I think in French, it's called VMA, vitesse maximale aerobique. Okay, so the second concept is a running endurance. And this basically measures how long a runner can maintain a certain power output, which is sub-maximal. So let's say a runner, we would like to study how long a runner can maintain 80% of maximum oxygen uptake or maximum power. And so this is a certain time, and then we can do this for different relative power outputs and measure the corresponding curve. And there have been various concepts in the literature for this curve. The most famous one is probably going back to almost 100 years to the famous physiologist Hill. He proposed a model that gives the power P as a function of time as a sum of two components. The first one is the anaerobic energy, which is available only a limited amount of time. So power is energy per time. So we have to divide this anaerobic energy by time. This gives the first part, and then there's an aerobic contribution, which is renewable, and therefore this is an aerobic contribution to the power independent of time, as long as there are, of course, carbohydrates available. But this is the general model that has been used. But if you look at this model, for long enough times, we can ignore the first term, the term becomes large, and then it's basically saturating at a constant number. So this is in contradiction for long races, especially the marathon, where this equation would predict that aerobic power could be sustained for an infinite duration. And this is not true. And the other problem is that this curve, the true behavior of this curve, is extremely difficult to measure in a laboratory because one cannot have a runner running on a treadmill for 2 or 3 hours under realistic outdoor conditions. Now, coming back to Hill, what he actually observed is very interesting. So this is from a paper that is almost 100 years old. And I think it's a very excellent observation made 100 years ago by not looking at laboratory measurements, but looking at the time world records in running. So here there's a number of curves, but what is important here is this curve that I've marked in red. These are running records for men in 1925. And as you can see, there are 2 linear branches that I've marked in red. And I should point out that this axis, the vertical axis, gives the average running speed. And the horizontal axis is the duration of the race, but on a logarithmic scale. See, it's 10, 100 seconds, 1,000 seconds. So it's increasing logarithmically, which means there is a logarithmic time dependence for the average running speed with 2 different slopes and a very precise change of slope at about 200-300 seconds. So this is an old observation, which was just an observation made by Hill without any explanation why it is like this. So coming back to our model, we wanted to find a model that explains this logarithmic dependence and can explain world running records and applied to even big data collected by these smartwatches. So our model, I don't want to go into the mathematical details of the model. I want to really stay on the focus on the practical aspects. So it's a model based on power, aerobic and anaerobic power. It's a universal approach in the sense that I don't fix a priori any parameters. So the model will have 4 parameters, but there is no other constants or parameters in this model fixed. And it is derived from basic experimental observations. And the most important here is that the power to run at a given speed is actually not a constant quantity. It increases with the duration, and this increase beyond the base power I call excess power. And this has various effects. The physiological, or the various reasons, the physiological reasons for this are not properly understood. There's muscle fatigue, there's a rise of body temperature, there's an increasing inefficiency of the breathing apparatus. So there are many aspects, but this is something that has been observed. So this is a basic assumption of our model, that there is a linear increase in this excess power with the duration of the race. And what does this mean? So to see what the consequences of this are, we measure the intensity, which can be the oxygen uptake, it can be measured by heart rate or power meters. So this power that we use, on which our model is based, is actually considered in a rescaled fashion. So let's say P is the power that the runner needs to run a given speed. Then I subtract from it the metabolic, the basal power. So this is the power at rest, and divide it by the maximum power output minus the basal power. So this is kind of what is called heart rate reserve, if you look at heart rates, and I'll call this the power reserve. So this quantity varies between 0, when the runner is at rest, and P equals PB, and 1, when P equals the maximum power output. So P equals between 0 and 1 in the aerobic range. But it can become larger as 1 for a short period of time if the runner uses also anaerobic energy contributions. Okay? So this is the central quantity of the model. And this we now have to link to the running speed by the linear running economy. And we have to understand this is this quantity, there's a linear relation. So if V equals the speed Vm at VO2 max, so this is a maximal aerobic speed, then P is 1. As I said, this is a maximum aerobic quantity for P equals 1, and the speed is 0, P is 0. So that's a very simple linear relation in this rescaled quantities. So this is the single parameter Vm that measures the energy cost of running. And the second important concept is the endurance. So this is the time for which a given relative power output P can be maintained. So we have to compute this function. And this is computed in our mathematical model by solving a self-consistency integral equation, which can be done easily. I don't show the details here. And this gives us the time over which the relative intensity P, which is between 0 and 1, can be sustained. Now, in this function, we have 3 parameters. There are 2 endurance indices, one for the aerobic and one for the anaerobic energy contribution, and a time scale at which this function has a crossover between these 2 ranges, so where P equals 1. So how does this look like? So this is the curve, the solution to our model. I'm showing here the time T of P as a function of the relative power. If P equals 1, this is the VO2 max point. And then from here, we have 2 branches emerging. The lower branch here is for the aerobic range, where the power output is less than 1 or less than 100%. And we found an exponential relation between the time that the power P can be maintained and the power. So if you invert this, it means that the power scales logarithmically with the time of the exercise. So this becomes already very similar to what Hill had observed. And on the other side, if the power output is larger than 1 or larger than 100%, this is an anaerobic branch, which again has an exponential behavior. So this is the basic result of our model. There is a function T of P, which gives the time over which a relative intensity can be sustained, and it has 2 exponential branches. And there's a crossover at a time Tc. I've divided here the function T of P by Tc, so this 1 corresponds to the time Tc where I have this crossover. Okay, so this is a model. Let's see how it works. We looked at various running records, and I would like to show you just the most recent world running records, which have been broken actually 2 times just a few months ago in October. And on the left side, I show you the current men's world running records. I show here the average speed of the event, starting at 1,000 meters, going up to the marathon. And here is the distance, but on a logarithmic scale. And again, we observe, but this is the exponential or logarithmic behavior of our model, logarithmic relation between the mean running speed and the mean distance. The distance is shown here in rescaled units because there's a certain crossover distance where we have two branches that merge. This is at a distance of about 2,300 meters, or a time corresponding to about 5 minutes and 30 seconds. And you see there is a almost perfect scaling, logarithmic scaling of all running times on this branch between 3,000 meters and the marathon, and the short distances on the other branch. So this is the orange curve. I show also for comparison what is known as a critical power model, and that's usually used below 10,000 meters, and you can see that it badly fails for larger distances. So this, I think, the orange curve gives a much better description of running records than the critical power model. And the 10,000 meters is actually the new world record, which fits very well into the scheme. Typical errors are given here, so they're far, far less than 1%, the agreement between actual data and the model. And we can do the same for the women's records, which has been broken for the 5,000 meters. And there are some deviations from the model. The most pronounced is probably the 3,000 meter record, which was set, I think, almost 30 years ago. But nowadays, one suspects that this record was obtained with some use of forbidden substances. So this is what our model would clearly indicate, that these 3,000 meters are way too fast compared to all other world records. So the model might be even used to detect some suspicious race results. Now, if we go back, we can also look at the last 100 years of world records. And I did this here from 1912 to today. And I'm very sorry for this interruption. I hope it works now. It's not, I think, very stable. So I try to finish within the next 8 to 10 minutes. I hope it works well. Okay, I'm not sure how far you could follow because I might have realized too late that the connection dropped. So I was talking about the application and verification of our model using the last 100 years of world records.
I think you should go back to the previous slide, maybe.
This one?
Yes, this is where it was cut.
I see. Okay, good.
If you could go full screen, that would be great. Wonderful, thank you.
Good. Okay, yeah. So what I'm showing here is the application of our model to the running world records of men between 1912 and today. And shown is the average predicting error for all distances between 800 meters and the marathon. And we are starting at a level about 1% mean error in 1912. And then it drops to about 0.2% in 1940 and stays at this level and even drops a little lower towards 0.1% in the last decade. So this looks all very consistent, but what can we learn from this? So the low errors suggest that the model works well. But now what can we learn from it? So it's actually interesting to look at two of the model parameters. The first one I'm showing here on the left is the running velocity at maximum oxygen uptake as a function of the year of time. We start 1912 and we see an almost linear increase of the speed at VO2 max, which is shown here in meters per minute, until about 2000, and then we see basically a saturation or even a slight downward trend. There are some sudden increases in this curve. Overall, it seems linear, but there are sudden jumps which are presumably linked to change of training philosophy, when people start to train more efficiently with new methods for longer distances. So this is something we currently study in more detail. A second interesting aspect is the endurance index, which is related to the coefficient of the logarithmic scaling between the velocity and the running distance. And for this curve, we also see an increase over time, but it's less clear linear as this speed increase here. So this is basically measured, speed is a measurement of aerobic power. And this is the endurance index, basically tells you, it's a number that tells you how long a runner can maintain 90% of the maximum power output. And so this has been constant for a long time. Then there were again sudden increases, presumably related to training. And then from the early 2000s to now today, an almost linear increase, which we think is related to basically African runners entering the half and full marathon races. And also the last increase probably is related to the adventure of a new running shoe technologies. We can compare the parameters that we extracted from the running world records also to direct laboratory measurements. And what I'm showing here is the fourth and last parameter of our model. This is the time in minutes that the runner can maintain 100% power output. That is so-called time to exhaustion at VO2 max, which we can compute from basically the merging of the two linear branches in our model. And we find as a function of time that it stays pretty constant around 5.5 minutes. And here's a table from a review article that reports basically treadmill running tests for this same time, and the average is 5.9 minutes with a standard deviation of 1 minute. So it's slightly higher, but very close to what we see in world records. And the slight difference might be related to the fact that this is done in a laboratory on a treadmill, while these are real running world records. And I guess it's without doubt that if you ask a runner to run in the Olympic Games, new world records, this is a different motivation than running on a treadmill in an exercise laboratory. So we think that these data are slightly more reliable, or at least realistic. Okay, finally, I would like to leave the field of world records and professional athleticism and come to the recreational runner and what we can learn from their data that they collect with these smartwatches nowadays. And so this is a project done in collaboration with the company Polar Electro in Finland, which provided a huge amount of data collected from these watches. So what these watches record, they record a lot of things, but what we analyzed in this first project was just the distance and time for each running session. We had available the age and gender of the user. We used all runners over 3 years that had completed a marathon and had 120 days of training recorded before the date of the marathon. And by applying such a filter, we could study about 19,000 runners with 2.5 million running activities, and they had completed altogether about 38,000 marathons. And we used as a model input the best performance in the marathon and also for the shorter distances of 5, 10 kilometers and the half marathon within the 120 days before the marathon. So we had this information about best performances, which we detected from all the running activities. We corrected GPS errors. Basically, if the distance was within 2% of the actual of the race distance, we used the actual race distance and not the GPS result. And also we filtered out inconsistent data sets where, for example, the running speed would increase with longer distance, which is clearly indicating an inconsistency. And we also analyzed the consistency of the training cycles during the 120 days. And we could altogether study about 24,000 marathons, including the full training cycles of 120 days, and therefore study not only the prediction for the physiological parameters extracted from their data, from their race results with our model, but also look at correlations to the training that the runners did in the 120 days before the marathon race. And think this is really a unique opportunity to look at this data and study these correlations between training and actual race performance. And so this was this work together with Polar Electro was just published a few months ago in Nature Communications. And I would like to, in the last couple of minutes, show you our main findings. So comparing the model to the race performances, we extracted the physiological parameters as we did for the world records, but now for each individual runner. Here's the probability distribution of the speed at VO2 max. In French, it's, I think, VMA. And this is a almost perfectly Gaussian distribution with an average about 4.5 meters per second. And I should also mention that we considered only runners that use exactly the same running watch, so that we rule out inconsistencies in GPS precision. And we used a high-end running watch that is usually used by, let's say, advanced marathon runners. So this might explain why the peak is at pretty large, relative large velocities. A completely different probability distribution we observed for the endurance, which decays exponentially. And a typical endurance in world records, it's between 7 and 8. And then there's a very small exponential tail, which might be an overestimate, but this gives also a nice distribution. And this is basically the endurance, as I said before, is the time for which 90% of the maximal power can be maintained. So this coefficient here, the number here, the endurance, multiplied by the time to exhaustion that I showed you previously, which is about 5 to 6 minutes, gives the time that the runner can maintain 90%. So it's really something practical that could be measured directly. So these are the probability distribution of physiological parameters in these 30,000 runners. Now, how do they relate to the marathon performance? So what I'm showing here on the left is the parameter space spent by the velocity at VO2 max and the endurance. And so this is kind of the, in terms of physics, like the phase diagram as a function of the model parameters. And as colored dots are shown the corresponding marathon performances. Red or violet means a fast time, and dark blue means a slow time. This is a time in minutes. And this is, again, the dashed lines show performances of equal time. So this would be a 2-hour marathon to 23 hours in this parameter space as predicted by our model. And you can see that the colors nicely follow the model predictions. And to come back to the beginning of my talk, where I said that just VO2 max, or the speed at VO2 max, is a bad predictor for marathon performance, this is clearly visible here, because these previously proposed one-parameter models would say that the speed or the time, finishing time of the marathon depends only on this parameter. Let's say we pick the velocity of 5 meters per second. You can see that this vertical line cuts through many different finishing times. So this is alone definitely not the correct answer, and the endurance is a very important parameter to be included. On the right-hand side, I'm just showing you for information the number of runners that we had in the different categories. So you see we cover well the entire parameter space, but the peak is clearly in the range between 3 and 4 hour, in this range between 4 and 5 meters per second for the maximal aerobic power, and endurance is between 3 and 4. So now what can we learn for training from this? Now we have these parameters and can compare to what the runners did in the 120-day training cycle before their marathon race. And so first I would like to show you 2 examples how the endurance correlates with different characteristics of their training. On the left, I'm showing how the endurance changes with the training intensity, which is measured as the average training speed of all the runs relative to the maximal aerobic speed, VM. So this is something very between 0 and 1. And there's a nice exponential increase of the mean endurance with this training intensity, telling us the endurance clearly increases with the intensity of your training. And this on the right side shows how the endurance changes not only with training intensity, but with a combined measure for training intensity and training volume. And so this is known as the training impulse, TRIMP, which is defined basically as a time average over the whole all running activities, where each time interval, let's say 1 minute, is weighted by the velocity of this time interval in an exponential fashion. Okay, so time intervals with a high running velocity get a much higher weight than time intervals with a low running velocity. And if you look now how the endurance changes in all our thousands of runners with this impulse, we see that it's a nice linear increase up to some point where it seems to saturate. There's bigger uncertainty because we don't have that many runners here included with 30,000 training impulse points. But there's clearly a saturation showing that it's not beneficial to just increase the training intensity, which would this graphic suggest, but also one has to keep in mind the combined quantity of volume and intensity, so not to overreach and go beyond this saturation level, which probably indicates that there are some effect of overtraining that prevents runners from reaching endurances in our scale of higher than 7 to 8. So this, I think, is an interesting finding. And then the second quantity is the maximal aerobic speed, how this changes with certain characteristics. There's clearly an increase with the total training distance during the 120 days, which varied between about 500 and 3,500 kilometers of running per runner. And again, this is a linear increase, which we think, and this is something that has been observed before in the lab, that running economy, that means the energy cost of running, decreases in runners that run a really high distance load during their training. And since running economy means better running economy means a higher speed, this is perfectly consistent with that. And the last result that I would like to show you is that this speed goes linearly down with the training intensity. And this seems to be at the first moment a little bit confusing, but our interpretation of this result is that slower runners that are located here train usually at higher relative intensity. So this is a relative intensity. I showed you our model parameter varies always between 0, meaning rest, and 1, which is a maximal aerobic speed. And so a slower runner has just a very small range of running speeds, because if he would go much slower, he would be basically walking. And so I think that's the reason why we see this decline here. And finally, I would like to show you what our model predicts for the marathon time. So we excluded the marathon time. We said we don't know it. And we just looked at the performances and the training before and tried to predict it. And I'm showing again the predicted time color-coded in the parameter space here. And the color coding now shows the relative error of our prediction. And as you can see in this range here, where most of our runners were located, the error is between about ±5%. And we have a larger error here, an underestimate and overestimate of the time only at the extreme low and high endurances, which appear unrealistic, and probably have to do that we are looking at a huge group of runners and we don't know how they trained in all races were recorded really consistently. So this we have to keep in mind. But what is interesting is that if you look at the probability distribution of the prediction error in percent as a function of the performance time, we see that faster runners, let's say we look at the two upper groups here for performances below 180 minutes, that is 3 hours, we see that for them the prediction error is within a margin of 5%, which is much better than what has been achieved before with single parameter models. And then for slower runners, there's a broader distribution of errors, but it's fair to say that we stay within the 10 plus minus 10% range. So I would like to conclude, what do coaches say about this model? And what we were really excited about, that one of the most popular running coaches in the United States, he wrote on his blog some article about our study of the running data from these smart watches recently. And while I learned that running coaches are usually very careful in looking in what scientists and exercise physiologists do, because they say there's training and practical work and research by exercise physiologists, and they don't fit always together, I was very excited to see that this coach finally said why runners should listen to the scientist. And if you're interested, you can look at this link where he gives his own very detailed interpretation of our graphs. He goes in very detail and says what a coach can learn from training marathon runners from our data. Okay, thank you very much. I'm again sorry for the interruption, and I hope I didn't use too much time. And finally, I would like to thank my collaborators that worked with me on this project, and I'm now available for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thorsten. And je pense que tu acceptes les questions en français aussi, il n'y a pas de souci.
I hope you are. Oui.
Voilà. Thorsten
Yes,
est en anglais, mais si vous voulez poser vos questions en français, il n'y a aucun problème. Donc, je ne sais pas s'il y a quelqu'un qui a une question. Ok, so, oui, vas-y, Vincent.
Moi, j'en ai une, c'est finalement un petit peu la même que celle que tu posais précédemment. Est-ce que ce modèle-là, j'imagine qu'on pourrait l'appliquer à autre chose que la course à pied? Je ne sais pas, sur d'autres épreuves de courte ou de longue distance, je dis n'importe quoi, l'aviron, le cyclisme, des choses comme ça, j'imagine?
Yes, so this is a very good question. We have looked at this, so right, it can be applied to cycling, or we were considering recently rowing. The only adaptation that has to be made is the relation between speed and power. In running, it's linear, but for cycling and rowing, because of air resistance, or in rowing, it's the resistance of the water, the drag force, the relation between the power output and the velocity is cubic. So if we put a bit, but this can be easily incorporated in our model, and we have just started to look at rowing world records, in particular for indoor rowing machines, where world records are also recorded. And this is a very well controlled environment, because these machines can directly measure the power output. So this will be another additional parameter that we can use to verify our model for other sports. Yes.
Donc, je crois qu'il y a une autre question de Ryan. Et on peut lui ouvrir le micro.
Ryan, il faut accepter de votre côté pour ouvrir le micro.
Là, vous m'entendez?
Oui, c'est bon.
Parfait. Donc, thanks for the presentation. So I have a question for the model.
Yes.
It's okay that your model take in account just the power and the speed, not other thing.
No, it takes into account two informations. It's a power to run at a given speed, which is a simple linear relation.
Yeah.
But the other important input is the time that a certain power can be maintained. So it's a relation between power output, sub-maximal power, as a function of time of the exercise.
Okay, sorry, but I think I asked in the wrong way my question. Oh. So it's more about you don't take in account other parameter of perhaps player training, or that don't have a link with the performance, sleep quality, or the thing.
No. Okay, no, okay. No, we don't take into account any additional parameters during training. What we really use only is all the exercise sessions that we recorded by this device that the runners wear, and this is the running distance and the running time of each session individually.
Okay.
That's all
So,
we use. But it's true that we have also for some of the runners information about, let's say, heart rate. But this is also during the exercise. I think what you are asking is if we measure also other factors during the training season, like I think you said sleep quality or maybe some recovery status. It would be interesting, but for these thousands of runners that we had, it was just not possible. But I agree this would be very interesting.
yeah, okay.
Does this answer your question?
Yeah. Just for me, because power and speed and time don't cover, for example, training load. Because we can measure training load, and perhaps we can do better prediction with other measure of training load, perhaps.
Well, we measure training load in the sense that we measure it based on the volume, that is distance, and the speed relative to the maximum speed, which we know from our model. So I'm not sure if you're familiar with this idea of TRIMP points. So this is So this is how we measure the training load.
Okay.
But I'm sure there are other methods, and yeah, I mean, it might be interesting if there are other methods to do it, to apply this as well. Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, I would have a very quick question that I have already asked you, is whether there is a hope you think in your model to include strategy for long distance, because it's for certain that for 10,000 meters, for instance, they don't run, they vary their strategy all along the race. And could you include something like that in your model?
Okay, our model is a long distance. Basically, we're focusing on the marathon, and the strategy for the marathon, if you study marathon performances, is pretty clear. It's running the speed as constant as possible. So I think there is no doubt about that. I know that some people propose to vary the speed a lot. And I was actually wondering if we can use our model to estimate the total energy cost for two different scenarios. One way the runner runs constantly, completely constant speed, and another scenario where the runner would modulate the speed or increase it at the end or decrease it. But what has been seen in practice, that the best performances are obtained in the marathon, at least, when the speed is basically completely constant. There are some tactical, of course, effects, especially over the last, let's say, mile of a marathon. But overall, the speed is run at a very constant level, because small races in speed during the marathon would be a problem, since the marathon speed is very close, slightly below what is known, let's say, as a lactate threshold. So going with the speed slightly over it would basically disturb the equilibrium of the runner so much that he would not be able to come back to a normal pace afterwards. So I think this is my understanding, but to use the model to really prove it, that we haven't done yet. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much.